Shannon Follins keeps plastic jugs of frozen tap water in her freezer, not for convenience, for survival. She calls them her preparation for water days, the times when there's nothing else to fill her 3 children's bellies but water and a mother's promise that tomorrow might be better. Shannon is a single mother in Columbus, Ohio, studying for a social services degree while raising 3-year-old twins, one autistic and still searching for his words. She's exactly the kind of hardworking American that politicians claim to champion, and she's about to discover what happens when fiscal responsibility meets human need.
What we're seeing in Ohio reveals how abstract policy decisions translate into concrete human consequences. In March 2025, the Trump administration cut over $1 billion in federal food assistance, canceling the local food purchase assistance program that provided $500 million annually to food banks, and freezing another $500 million in emergency food assistance funding. These weren't hypothetical budget line items. They were truckloads of milk, eggs, and meat that were supposed to arrive but never did.
We ordered 24 truckloads of food in December: milk, meat, eggs, using $1.5 million in government funding through the TAFAP program. The first delivery was scheduled for April 9th. What showed up instead was a cancellation notice. These cuts wiped out 22% of our buying power overnight. For families like Shannon's, that doesn't mean slightly less variety. It means the difference between a meal and water days.
Ohio presents a particularly stark case study. Nearly 1 in 3 residents qualify for food assistance. That's over 1.6 million people food insecure, including 386,000 children. This is happening in a state that handed Trump 3 consecutive electoral victories, where you literally see Trump flags flying next to food aid flyers on community bulletin boards. The contradiction tells us something important about how political rhetoric translates into lived reality.
Today we're examining how policy abstractions become family realities, how the gap between political messaging and policy implementation affects real people, and why Shannon Follins' Water Days reveals something essential about the human cost of fiscal austerity in communities that voted for it. To understand Ohio's current crisis, we need to see what food insecurity actually looks like beyond the statistics. Shannon works at getting her twins ready for daycare, then takes the bus to her social services classes, studying to build a career that might eventually lift her family out of poverty. Until recently, she worked the overnight shift at Waffle House for $5.25 an hour, a job that barely covered childcare costs.
Shannon represents what economists call the working poor, people employed or actively improving their skills, but whose wages haven't kept pace with basic living costs. Her situation illustrates how food insecurity isn't about people avoiding work. It's about economic systems where full-time employment doesn't guarantee food security, especially for parents managing child care and education costs simultaneously.
Shannon relies on the food pantry at Broad Street Presbyterian Church, which gets its supplies from Mid-Ohio Food Collective, Ohio's largest food bank. On good days, her daughter Essence dances barefoot across their kitchen floor, while Shannon cooks chicken Alfredo with bowtie pasta and frozen broccoli. These aren't elaborate meals, but they represent something more than survival. They represent a mother's ability to provide dignity through food.
Mid-Ohio was born nearly 50 years ago in church basements and borrowed trucks when factory closures left families hungry. Today, we feed over 35,000 Ohio families weekly through more than 600 pantries, soup kitchens, and feeding programs. But we were already struggling before these cuts. Pantry visits across our 20 counties hit 1.8 million last year, nearly double pre-COVID levels, as working families found their paychecks couldn't stretch to cover both rent and groceries.
Then came March 2025. The USDA canceled 2 major programs: the Local Food Purchase Assistance Program that funded local food purchases and froze funding for the Emergency Food Assistance Program. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rowland said the cuts ensure federal nutrition spending is efficient, effective, and aligned with the administration's budget priorities. But efficiency measured how?
These programs served dual purposes, supporting local farmers by purchasing their products and providing fresh, nutritious food to families in need. When you eliminate that connection, you're not just cutting food assistance, you're disrupting entire food systems that support rural economic development. The Local Food Purchase Assistance Program specifically helped small and minority farmers access institutional markets they couldn't reach independently.
Meanwhile, Ohio's state government faces its own constraints. Governor Mike DeWine and Republican lawmakers, required to pass a balanced budget, say they don't have extra money for food banks. The proposed Ohio budget would cut food bank funding to 2019 levels, 23% less than current spending, in a state where food insecurity has grown significantly since 2019.
This creates a perfect storm of policy failure. Federal cuts eliminate existing food sources, while state budgets reduce local capacity to fill gaps. The math is straightforward but harsh. When federal funding disappears and state funding shrinks, the difference gets absorbed by families like Shannon's through reduced food access. The policy savings translate directly into increased hunger.
The human impact shows up in places like Mid-Ohio's greenhouse, built on land where a state psychiatric hospital once stood. Volunteers now harvest cucumbers and pack romaine lettuce, not because growing their own food is more efficient, but because they can no longer rely on federal purchasing programs to provide consistent supplies. They're literally growing their way out of policy failures.
We're installing beehives for honey and preparing soil for fruit trees because we've learned we can't depend on federal consistency. Our staff now spend hours each day chasing leads from grocers, manufacturers, even truckers looking to unload abandoned freight. Every pallet helps, every pound counts. But this isn't how food systems should work, with major institutions scrambling for abandoned cargo to feed families.
The cuts have already reached family dinner tables. At Mid-Ohio's Norton Market, a food pantry built inside a former Kroger store to reduce stigma and restore dignity to food assistants, the shelves tell the story. Denver Burkhart, a 35-year-old Army veteran with tour in Afghanistan and Iraq, manages the operation with military precision, but even his logistics skills can't conjure food that doesn't exist.
What's particularly troubling is the demographic data. Ohio food banks report unprecedented demand from working families, people with jobs who simply can't afford both housing and food. We're seeing middle-income households accessing food assistance for the first time, not because they've become lazy or dependent, but because wage growth hasn't kept pace with the cost of basic necessities.
Shannon's water days aren't an anomaly, they're a policy outcome. When she fills her children's bellies with tap water and promises tomorrow might be better, she's not failing as a mother. She's demonstrating remarkable resourcefulness within a system that has effectively abandoned families like hers, while maintaining rhetorical support for hardworking Americans.
The broader context makes this even more concerning. These food assistance cuts are happening while the administration proposes additional reductions. $300 billion in SNAP cuts that would force Ohio to spend $475 million annually just to maintain current benefit levels. That would consume 95% of the state's Department of Job and Family Services budget, potentially affecting everything from unemployment assistance to foster care.
The political messaging around these cuts emphasizes reducing dependency and promoting self-sufficiency. But Shannon is actively working towards self-sufficiency, studying for a degree while raising 3 children. The food assistance doesn't create dependency. It provides the stability that makes advancement possible. When you're worried about feeding your kids, it's difficult to focus on coursework or job training.
What people don't understand is that food banks were never meant to be permanent solutions. We're emergency relief. We became the backbone of America's anti-hunger system because wages stagnated while living costs rose. These cuts don't solve dependency. They just move the crisis from visible food lines back into homes, where families like Shannon's quietly manage with water days and frozen jugs of hope.
At a recent Ohio Republican fundraiser, potential gubernatorial candidate Vivek Ramaswamy spoke to audiences wearing both business suits and bikers for Trump gear about ending a culture of dependence on the entitlement state that has festered for 60 years. Meanwhile, in that same state, Shannon checks her ice supply and wonders if her food assistance will survive the next round of cuts.
This disconnect between political rhetoric and lived reality reveals something important about how policy actually functions. Politicians can speak about ending dependency to applause, while families in their districts quietly adapt to policy consequences through strategies like water days. The political success of anti-dependency messaging doesn't reduce actual need. It just makes that need less visible and less politically costly.
Shannon's story reveals the human cost of treating fiscal policy as abstract mathematics rather than family reality. When government spending gets reduced, that reduction doesn't disappear. It gets transferred to families through increased hunger, stress, and impossible choices between basic necessities. The costs don't vanish, they just become private instead of public.
What makes this particularly tragic is that food assistance programs are among the most economically efficient forms of government spending. Every dollar in SNAP benefits generates approximately $1.50 in economic activity. Food banks like Mid-Ohio leverage government purchases to support local farmers, transportation companies, and food processing, creating economic multiplier effects that benefit entire communities, not just food-insecure families.
The real tragedy is that we know how to solve hunger in America. We just lack the political will to do it consistently. Shannon doesn't need charity. She needs systems that recognize her work and education efforts by ensuring that employment provides living wages and that temporary assistance actually helps families transition to stability rather than merely survive day to day.
The data shows us what works. Integrated support that addresses housing, food, healthcare, and education simultaneously rather than forcing families to choose between necessities. Shannon's water days aren't inevitable. They're the result of policy choices that prioritize fiscal austerity over human development, treating poverty as a personal failing rather than a systemic challenge requiring systematic solutions.
Dr. Martinez, Matt, Dr. Collins, thank you for showing us how policy abstractions become family realities. Shannon Follins' water days aren't just personal adaptation to hardship. They're the direct result of choices made in Washington and Columbus about whose needs matter when budgets get balanced. Her frozen jugs of water represent a mother's resourcefulness, but they also represent a system's failure to recognize that investing in families like hers isn't dependence, it's development. This episode was brought to you by Unstruct, where we examine the human cost of policy decisions that treat people as budget line items rather than human beings. Shannon Follins keeps water in her freezer because she understands something that policymakers often miss. When systems fail, families adapt, but adaptation shouldn't be necessary when resources exist to prevent that adaptation from being required. When we cut food assistance programs by $1 billion while maintaining rhetorical support for hardworking families, we create a gap that gets filled by mothers promising hungry children that tomorrow might be better. Shannon's water days reveal the true cost of fiscal responsibility that isn't actually responsible to the people it affects. Her 3 children, including an autistic son still searching for his words, don't need their mother to be more self-sufficient. They need systems that recognize her work, support her education, and ensure that full-time effort provides family stability. The jugs of frozen water in Shannon's freezer aren't just emergency provisions. They're evidence of a policy system that has learned to balance budgets by transferring costs to families least equipped to bear them. Progress without humanity isn't progress at all. When austerity meets hunger, children don't eat less, they just eat less visibly, in homes where mothers improvise survival while politicians debate dependency. The families who understand these shifts early will adapt and thrive, but they shouldn't have to.